Okay, I think we're live. So, welcome everybody to our Earthwalk Ways live stream podcast, all things Earthwalk Ways. Today we're gonna have a special program, maybe extra long. But first, I just want, as usual, sort of mark our place on the medicine wheel and the great astrological medicine wheel in the sky. Uh, as well as, the Earth medicine wheel. So, this is our Paschal moon, April full moon, that's in Libra. And I find that it's a very apropos kind of place to find ourselves right in now because, the sun is opposite Libra in Aries. So, these are the poles, the self, and relationship, the we and the I. So, it's kind of like the study that we are in. And I think the full moon in Libra is hopefully going to bring us a little more balance. Um, Libra is a beautiful, beautiful sign, and it's through this balance that beauty arrives. And, as part of the heartbreak of war and tragedy is, that so much beauty is destroyed. So, not to mention human lives and that kind of thing, but there's also all of the other beings that are impacted. So, this is something again where, what's self and what's not self, is a big study for us at this time, and how to be in relationship with all of it, and in harmony and in balance and in right relationship, as our indigenous brothers and sisters would say. So, this is also the first full moon after the equinox, which of course is another expression of balance of the light and the dark, of night and day. Um, and then here we are, the first full moon after the equinox also marks the time of Passover and Easter. And so, again, if we look at Yeshua's fundamental message, it was to love each other as we love ourselves, right? And it's interesting because I think most people, think that, we should, like love each other in a kind of same way. But I think it's more like first we have to truly have healthy love for ourselves. And then there is a natural extension of that to others. So I think a lot of times, people that are not loving of others have a certain, self-judgment and contempt of their own selves. So, this is where the self-love needs to come from a sort of self-respect, humility, and then that gives us dignity. And this is what we should offer every other being in our world. And through this, I think we'll restore balance and harmony. And this will help us then walk in beauty and in peace. So, here at the Earthwalk, we're beginning our, opening kinds of spring things. And so we're going to have a community fire circle for the full moon Friday evening. It's kind of like spontaneous. I didn't know if we were going to have a full moon, and it looks like the weather's going to be good. So I'm just kind of sending it out, to the local community. Like if you live in this area and want to get on the mailing list, let me know. And then, we're going to, work in that full moon fire circle, with this beautiful curricula, and maybe learn a little more about how to make peace within ourselves as the first step. And then we'll have a community fire circle. Then we're going to have Sunday, April 19th. We're having an Earth Day event. And I love singing, and I know nature loves singing. And so it will be, a forest bathing, experience, probably walking out to the river along Enchanting Run. And then we'll come back and have a little song fest because, I think that that's one of the best ways that we can, get filled up by nature and then complete the circle and give it back. And in praise and thanksgiving and joyful singing, it's our way of participating. One of my hymns says, I'm another forest bird, praising with my song. So, we're here to honor the earth, and I think that's a beautiful way to do that for that day. And I'm not sure, it kind of falls in the middle of the week, so I think there's probably going to be various Earth Day celebrations, but for me, the 19th will work the best. So join me here if you can. And then um, May 2nd, we're going to be opening our first Natural Communion Sweat Lodge for the direction of the East. And so that will be a weekend event if people want to come and camp and join us on the lodge on Sunday. And all of these events, if people are of distance away, we have camping and trailers and some B&B that, you might, want to stay at if you want to just come down for an event, but find a place to stay so you don't have to travel so far in a day. Okay, so let's get into our very special program today. I said it might go a little longer. So we're going to look into and offer a sacred story, an archetypal story, a story, very deep with meaning like a dream coming from our own collective deepest psyche. And so this is like an allegory for Easter. And I find that it's sort of beyond the Easter time, but, that's kind of where the story leads us to. And it helps also understand the context and this kind of deeper metaphysical and also allegorical way of looking at it. So I find this, kind of a very interesting and deep little story that I like to play with. I invite you to play with, and we'll just be reading through what is a composite of 4 Pathwork lectures. And, the guide kind of weaves the story through other commentary in those lectures. So feel free to read 19, 20, 21, and 22. But this one is just following the basic storyline of what the guide calls God the creation, the fall of the angels, and the plan of salvation. So this is a kind of sacred story which works on us at a deeper level than just sort of the informative or historical level. Other historical stories as well, they're once historical and timeless. It's kind of the mythic realm. And our culture has lost connection with that to some degree. We don't understand that in the same way that I think we originally did when we related a lot with sort of a language that we spoke. And that was how we passed on, wisdom and our collective was through the stories. And so we've lost that a little, but this one I think maybe might be of use and that you'll enjoy. So and the teachings are multi-leveled, and they really can't be conveyed through a single concept, or so it's through the symbols and the archetypes and the stories that they can really reveal their riches. And this story is sort of a big story of how we came to be and what our purpose is. And this is called a cosmology. And so this pathwork has, and the guide offered this cosmology, like I said, about the fall of the angels and the plan of salvation. And it's all centered around the importance of free will. And the incarnation of the Christ, that happened was done to preserve our free will, and to help us lead us back to God. So, back to, the higher state before the fall of the angels, right? Or maybe even to bring more of God into the earth, I don't know. But there was this kind of reconciliation and a continuation of a story in this context that began when we were all angels, right? And so who are the fallen angels? We're the fallen angels. And so let's go ahead and just get into the story. I find it also sort of a unique lens with some deep reflections for a contemplation of Easter. So I like to reread it every year at this time. So, God, the creation, is sort of this original blessing, right? And before the earth was created, God created, Christ, the first being, and then in Christ all things were made of the same, made from that substance of Christ is sort of how uh, the original understanding is. And so then it begins in this composite with, so who is Christ? Some Christian religions claim Christ is God. Some say Jesus was just a wise man, a sage, a great teacher with great wisdom. The truth is, my friends, whether you want to believe it, Jesus the man was the incarnation of the Christ. And this Christ spirit is the highest, most exalted of all created beings. He is the first direct and inborn creation of God, and his substance is the same as the substance of God. So, this is kind of the original clone in a way, or, maybe the first copy, but there's this way that, it's kind of like this is maybe where the confusion sometimes in scripture, the only begotten Son of God comes from. But then the lecture goes on to talk about how in all of the rest of us were created from that substance. So I think it adds a little different perspective on that, and in some ways, like, I think it's accurate to say that we're all children of God, all made in that likeness. And so continuing with the journey, he says, all of you possess some of this substance, which I call the higher self, or the divine spark. It has to come out gradually through spiritual development. But no other created being has this substance in quite the same degree as the Christ. So God put forth as his first creation the Spirit of Christ, and the man Jesus was the incarnation of that being on earth in history. But long before Jesus, in the beginning was the Word, the Christ consciousness, the firstborn, from which all other creatures came into existence, so many that you could not count them with the numbers you have available in your world. Once I was asked, why did God create these beings? Being all-knowing, God must have realized that misery could result from it. This is indeed an important question which I would like to touch on briefly. God is love, and love must share. This is the nature of love. Of course, God realized that because he created beings with free will, they could so decide with this free will that misery could come into existence, either permanently or temporarily. Nevertheless, as an indication of greatness, God created beings who could choose freely with the power given them. And they would either have the wisdom of not abusing their power, and thus living within the perfection of divine law in a state of eternal bliss. Or if they decided otherwise, they would finally come to comprehend all the more the perfection of divine law after having gone through the valley of death. Thus they would be more godlike than ever before. The temporary misery for those who might decide wrongly is nothing compared to the bliss and happiness of eternity after the self-inflicted misery has been experienced. So I think one image that I've been given with this is kind of like, like the experience of falling into the darkness, kind of like we went deep into the well, we hollowed out our being with, some of the challenges and the difficulties that are here. And so the deeper that well, the more love, the more grace, the more light it can hold. So, it's a kind of way that, we really, chose maybe a more difficult path, but in that maybe also, that we have a deeper depth of understanding, compassion, and learning that can be accomplished in that. And again, some people, we all have free will. Some people, you know, take that on and internalize and become a living light within that. And, other people, you know, it's more challenging. And I think it's somewhat dependent on the, the strength, the level of development of each soul, right? So we're here doing different things. But anyway, God created many beings and many worlds long before a material world existed. There were worlds of harmony, happiness, infinite beauty, and infinite possibilities, which unfolded creative divine aspects for all beings. Here before the fall, the divine substance of each created being was freely active and not covered by foreign and ungodlike matter. I have often said that it is your task to uncover this divine substance within you and to free it of the God-opposed layers which rob you of your unity with yourself and with God. This divine substance is also referred to as a human being's higher self or divine spark. It is also referred to at times as the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is not one being, nor is it a part of a threefold God in the sense it is often interpreted. It is simply the divine substance that every living creature possesses to some degree, whether freed of other substances or still covered up by them. The divine spark within you is godlike. Only this purified and freed substance within you is capable of uniting with God, and therefore of being one with God. No substance that is unlike God can unite with him, or can unite with God, him, her, both. So people often advance the idea that God should not have endowed God's creatures with free will, for then the fall would not have happened. They claim God at least should have interfered when the fall started. However, this view is short-sighted and blind. Happiness can only exist for any created being through union with God. And to be in union with God, you must be of the same substance and endowed with the same aspects and qualities. Otherwise, you would be unlike God and thus incapable of being in union with him. Free will and free choice entails the possibility of directing free will contrary to divine law. In choosing freely and correctly and in abstaining from abuse of power lies divinity, love, wisdom, and a number of further divine attributes. God has also put into creation an infinite number of laws. These laws provided beforehand for the possibility of a return to God if any of the created beings should misuse their power and freedom given them by God. These laws work in cycles which have to close. Whatever happens, laws work in such a way that ultimately everything having once turned away from God and divine law will eventually come back. The greater the distance from God, the more the misery, for only in and with God lies happiness. So, before and after the fall, spiritual worlds did exist for a very, very long time, where all created beings lived in a state of bliss in a way that is unimaginable. The possibility existed, since they came into existence, to choose freely either to live within divine law or to act against it. At one time, one spirit fell under the temptation to act against it. Perhaps you are able to comprehend some of this when you imagine what it is like to possess great power. You may know that to use this power in a certain way might prove to be dangerous for you. Yet as long as this power is not exploited, you feel a curiosity about what could actually happen if you did use it. This temptation becomes stronger and stronger. You won't mean to continue to use this dangerous power, but you feel you must try it out just once to see. And so that began, once the first spirit succumbed to the temptation, it set something in motion that could not be changed anymore. The result was not an immediate change, but a gradual one. The change from harmony to disharmony took place, just as gradually and slowly as your personal growth occurs from disharmony to harmony. The latter is evolution, the former can be called devolution, and neither can ever happen suddenly. It was a simple thought that ran contrary to the unitive reality of the higher states. It was a thought that life was unfair, a feeling of victimization, that God's justice wasn't just, that God was unfair and played favorites, that other creatures knew better than God how it should go. And God gave them free will. So if they choose to believe lies and rebel against God, God would not force them or judge them. But God establishes the plan of salvation and waits until they discover and know this truth from within themselves again, having arrived at it from their own experience. So this began the fall. And it started with one spirit who succumbed and first generated a power running in the opposite direction to divine law. It was still the same power, only used differently. With this power, the spirit could affect and influence many other spirits little by little. But not all spirits were affected. There was a division between those who succumbed and those who did not. Those who succumbed, the fall of the angels began. And in this process, every divine aspect, this is very interesting to think about it here. In this process, every divine aspect turned into its opposite nature. Harmony turned to disharmony, beauty to ugliness, light to darkness, wisdom to blindness, love to hatred, fear, or egotism. And union became separateness. The wholeness split even further the more this pole of temptation proceeded. Thus, separation and defense, materialism and addiction, confusion and deceit came into existence. Once I explained that the spiritual worlds are psychological worlds, which does not mean that they are unsubstantial and formless. Only in your material world are thoughts and feelings abstract. In other worlds, spirits create their own worlds wherein they live according to their states of mind. Each state of mind creates as a reflex action a sphere consisting of landscapes, inner and outer conditions, and so on. When you keep in mind that your attitudes, your thoughts, your feelings, your opinions, and your goals create your world, you will understand that the world of the highest spirits is beautiful and light, while the world of the fallen spirits has become dark and painful. Since the great plan was put in operation, many in-between worlds came to exist in various degrees of harmony and disharmony, according to the state of development which the once fallen spirits had reached. Your material world is one of these in-between worlds. The disharmonious worlds which came into existence through the separation from God are also called hell. These worlds simply reflect the state of mind of the creatures living there. These spheres came into existence as a direct result of the state of mind of these beings. But hell is not just one sphere. There are many spheres there, just as there are many spheres in the divine world, or so-called heaven. And I think, we can see where, sometimes we go through, periods of living in hell realms, even here on earth, right? Our state of mind, again, can, see whatever is happening, as half empty as half full, as, trusting it's some part of a bigger journey that we don't understand or feeling, somehow, you know, rejected and defeated by the complexity and the confusion of life, which, is certainly there. And it's like a very powerful initiation that every soul undertakes in this incarnatory experience here, in this world that, you know, is created since the fall, and a place where there's both the influence of light and darkness. So free will can become effective. So, as long as complete purification has not been achieved, some of the characteristics of the fall are still going on within a person to some degree. It would be extremely useful for each one of you to delve into your soul and clearly come to feel this process, thus making it conscious. So, there's a spiritual battleground sort of in our psyches in a way that oftentimes we're not very conscious of it, or we're feeling the effects of it and we don't know what to do with it, and we get like merged, with one side or the other, and it doesn't, resolve. So, this is where, he's saying it helps for us to bring consciousness into what's happening for us. Thus, when we consider our faults, we should also try to find the original divine aspect of them. He says, for no fault could come into existence by itself. It's only a distortion of something that was once divine. And so this helps. I mean, even sort of our perfectionism, which I think, sometimes we believe is the God inside telling us to be that way. But I think if we look at, sort of the energy of that, and how, it's painful, to be under the whip of the perfectionist. And and so I think there's a way in which, we need to see, well, what is the divine aspect of the perfectionist in proper balance? It's kind of taken over, and it's, confused, and it thinks that the way to achieve, healthy balance and, highest aspirations is, to, whip us when we fail or something like that. So, there's a way that, again, distortion and divinity comes in so much of everything that we're working with, and it really does help to try to find the original divine aspect of things. And he says you can find this divine aspect in all your faults, and then it will be so much easier to purify your faults, and at the same time lose your sense of hopelessness and inferiority about yourself. So in some ways, the spirit of control is this important divine aspect of free will or freedom of choice, that we were given, and then we kind of, as children, are, trying to survive, and, we're taught by our families, by our, own inner, voices, that this is what it means to survive, to stay safe, to be okay, to not get in trouble, So, this free will, that we originally were given sort of converts, it had to turn into its opposite too. And to me, it's kind of like that's the spirit of control. And the spirit, that really, I think, was the first to succumb to the temptation of abusing power, right? The one that we often refer to as Lucifer or Satan or the devil. And then that being influenced others to follow. But he was the first one to inhabit the fallen spiritual dimensions that came into existence. And so this spirit really had complete power over all those who followed him. And contrary to God, who gives free will, the Pathwork Guide says, Lucifer used this power. So God gives the freedom of choice, and this has deeper significance than most of you realize. With that freedom comes the possibility to abuse the given power and to use it contrary to the divine laws. But if no choice were available, there would be no freedom and no power. There can be no divine happiness, in fact, no divinity at all, if it cannot be attained or maintained by free choice. By the same token, the opposite of God and his laws, must be the prohibition of free choice and the domination of the stronger over the weaker ones. This state of affairs would seem to make the salvation of the fallen beings impossible, for even should they have come to the point of desiring to go back to God, they would not have had the power to do so, since they were under the dominion and power of the one who reigns in the worlds of darkness. On the other hand, without breaking his own laws, which is, the main point here, how could God save those beings who longed for him? If God were to use God's infinite power by overruling the free will, and so the choice of those who decided to use the given power in their own way, he would, somehow revoke, right, or something, and then if God used this power that he had, contrary to our free will, then he would actually be acting from that same principle as Lucifer. So here, more than anything else, maintaining the divine principle was of utmost importance. For only if God remained true to this divine nature and the divine laws would there be any fundamental difference between the ways of God and the ways of Lucifer. Since it is God's plan that every creature should recognize and at one time come back to God's state of peace, out of free choice, and reattain divinity, it was imperative that he not use the same means of force as his opponent, even though his purpose might be a good one. It is not the end alone that counts, but very much the means too. Only by remaining true to these principles would the most stubborn of the fallen beings one day see the vast difference between these two ways of being, and understand the dignity that lies in the divine principles, even though that choice requires a path of humility and acceptance of suffering for those who wish to get out of the self-created negative circumstances. Excuse me. So from here, we go into the plan of salvation. So continuing in the composite lecture, the guide says, since life in spirit is in direct relationship to the inner harmony, enlightenment, and general attitude, spirits who have become disharmonious cannot be simply put into a world of harmony as you might travel into a beautiful country. In the world of spirit, the country is both you and your product, and therefore the once fallen spirits had and still have to attain a state where again they naturally produce harmonious worlds. You will really understand now that this must happen in free choice. Questions like why has God not done away with evil need not come up in our, deliberations. Like that free will in, the ability to choose against God is something that's, very important. And we have to learn how to, produce the positive and natural worlds again through that free will. They won't come. I mean, if we're coerced, if we're forced, we'll just be resentful, right? Or we'll just be, feeling like somehow we're being limited and we will want to rebel. So, our divine parents, I think, are very wise, especially compared to our human parents, which, they're all like us, kind of lost in, this world of illusion. But we're continuing on now. There is a way that, after the fall, God really, was aware that this was happening and said, well, when they return, they'll be better gods than before. And from there, he proceeded to make sure that there were laws in place and, like this plan of salvation. And so the lecture continues. Means had to be found then so that the creatures who desired to return to God and to keep his laws instead of Lucifer's could do so within the framework of the laws of God. Thus the free will of no one would be broken, not of Lucifer himself, nor of the souls that were ready to find their way home. So this is the great plan of salvation in which Christ played a major role. In the aftermath of the fall, the spheres of darkness first came into existence where the spirits lived under the dominion of Lucifer. And in the beginning there was no longing for or even sense of the light that they had once long ago possessed. Only after tasting the self-chosen medicine for a considerable time, it's like, sometimes I think, like the amount of time between, the original Big Bang maybe, and the creation of the Earth sphere, is billions of years, and linear clock time, so, or speed of light time, and so then, it's almost as if we lived in energetic realms and spaces, that were not so physical, and in each of those there was, definitely a certain level of darkness, and the, influence of the light was not as strong. So it was kind of like where the plan of salvation included the creation of the Earth sphere. So only after tasting the self-chosen medicine for a time, experiencing a state of desolation, did a vague longing for something else, and this is the fallen angels, they did not quite know what, took hold of some of these beings. The vague longing that first some and later more creatures felt was sufficient to bring a glimmer of light into their world, as though a faraway dawn changed the contours of their world a little bit. When enough spirits came into the state of longing, and the longing increased, the time was ripe for the physical earth as you know it to come into existence. You may say that God created the material world, and this is true, for nothing can be created without the creative divine force. However, it is equally true that the material world was also created by the longing of enough spirits for something higher. The world in which you are now living is the product of the desire to strive higher. Here conditions exist in which spiritual development can proceed, in which a free choice for God can be made, which is impossible in the worlds of darkness. In other words, this earth sphere is a product of the longing of the fallen spirits, and it is equally a product of the longing of those beings who remained with God, and whose deepest desire was always and is always to bring their brothers and sisters back to God. Therefore, both the divine worlds and the worlds of darkness helped in the creation of this earth sphere. The influence of both worlds exists and will manifest according to the attitude of each individual being on this plane, possessing the power of free choice. On earth, where the influence of God's world also existed for the first time since the fall, the fallen spirits had the opportunity to learn, to change, to turn to God, and thus to create a better world for themselves in both matter and spirit. They would go to the spirit world after the death of the body, and also during sleep when the body rested. And from the spirit world they would receive inspirations and influences of all sorts. And at all times through history, beings of light were also guiding the fallen souls. If God's world had not acted on this earth too, there would not have been any difference between the earth sphere and a sphere in the world of darkness. How did the influence of the world of God manifest itself? This would seem to be an impossibility, since according to universal law, an individual human being has to make the first step in order to receive help from the world of God. In other words, if we don't ask, like God's world can't respond. So how could this step be made if the whole entity was still so coarse that it had no inkling of God, no idea of this world, and no notion of what to do? The answer is that pure spirits who remained in the divine worlds were incarnated at all times. To be sure, very few were incarnated at one time, but the influence of one such being outweighs by far the strength and influence of 100 creatures of the world of darkness. The spirits who were incarnated from the world of God brought with them light, love, and wisdom. They fulfilled a great mission with their incarnation on earth, and their influence was much more far-reaching than might have appeared at first sight. With this influence growing steadily through the ages, the fallen spirits during their incarnation on earth could freely choose what side to listen to, the side that reached their lower nature, or the side that seemed to push them ever upward, regardless of the difficulties encountered. By such free choice, God's law concerning this aspect of life was not violated. Gradually, more of the fallen spirits came into the state where they could recognize God. Their longing became conscious and meaningful. Their will could now be developed to overcome the impulses of their lower nature. The change that began to take place had a much greater effect than can be easily realized. Not one of us fully understands that if a single person develops really well, doing the best in his or her power, this person does not only help himself, but adds the most valuable cosmic power to a great reservoir. People will not know as long as they are on the earth how far-reaching the effect of the smallest endeavor in this direction is. So I think that's, a beautiful thing that he put in there, and it's important for us sometimes to remember that. On the earth sphere, you have the possibility with your free will, so we're going into salvation now, to develop and to decide which side to follow. In your own nature, you can, of course, find both currents. The good current that once came from God in perfection, and the evil, which is like interesting how it's lived backwards, right? So it's a backwards current, and that's what the guide is saying, that it was reversed. It was life, and it got turned upside down or backwards. And that current was accumulated during or after the fall. And between these two currents, the conscious self stands, able to discern, to decide, either to take the line of least resistance, which is even like, let's not even think about it, right? Let's not evaluate it. Let's not make a discernment. Let's just follow impulse. And we all have some of that. And, there's a balance because, again, what is that impulse but maybe the original sort of flow of life, and the divine nature of the being recognizing almost instantaneously, where it wants. And sometimes that intuitive thing is more wise, right? So, the difference between sort of the rebellious, just go for it, or the deeper listening to an intuitive that doesn't, message that doesn't make any sense to your mind maybe, but you feel the impulse and, follow it. So, there's this whole study in our discernment of these currents. And between these two currents, the conscious self stands able to decide either to take the line of least resistance, which is our lower nature, or to follow the higher self, which often, is the difficult and narrow path. But I want to say here that when we do, we are also like really helped, right? That there's spiritual support and protection in that. And in some way, we're not talking about a dualistic battle with some evil aspect of our nature, but really rather like an acceptance and an integration of all of these parts of us. And then I think when that happens, there's a natural alignment toward true pleasure, towards the light. Like a flower, we recognize the sun, right? And so there's a way that, it's usually not so useful when we get into a battle inside of ourselves or outside of ourselves in this realm of duality. So God's plan was ultimately that every single one of the fallen beings should have the means to come back to Him, back to the light and harmony. But it was essential that God's laws never be broken, not even for the purpose of bringing back the fallen creatures. So all the while creation was unfolding, Christ was busy preparing and working in the spirit world of God, planning ahead and sending various pure spirits to live on earth. He also organized teachings for the pure spirits now incarnated to bring to mankind, either through inspiration and guidance or through communication with God's world. At that time, no matter how far human beings developed spiritually, when returning to the beyond, they were still under the dominion of Lucifer. For as I explained, every divine aspect was turned into its opposite quality. Therefore, free will, which is divine, was turned into domination. And of course, Lucifer would not give up the dominion he held over his followers. If, for instance, a human being, due to a changing attitude and growing harmony with God, would begin to produce light and beautiful spheres in the spirit world, even these spheres still belonged to the kingdom of Lucifer, because he did not relinquish his power over this person. Furthermore, no one was at that time far enough developed to produce only spheres of light. People would produce and own several spheres, harmonious and disharmonious ones. This happens incidentally with each one of you and with every human being. Wherever there are faults, weaknesses, and blindnesses, corresponding spheres come into existence. Wherever you are pure and purified, you create beautiful spheres, and you will not only own the best, but also the worst of what you have built. This is not judgment, but feedback for understanding. It's kind of like our life is our guide, right? And we're meant to do trial and error. That's what free will is about, But then, if we don't like the results and then we try to deny or we try to, not face or, pretend that, that didn't really happen that way and let's try it again, we don't learn. The wisdom doesn't happen. And so, we want, to, and it's sometimes hard to fully understand, the meaning of, the consequences or the results or, what is the result of what. So it's a deeper discernment for sure. And it's not just to say, oh, I'm guilty and I'm bad, right? It's way beyond that to really understand the divine quality that is trying to be restored within each of us. And in order to do that, we have to go into the underworld and go into the darkness. So when we're doing this, like he's saying, like even now today, where we have, there's both pure and beautiful spheres that we've created and others. And I don't know if you feel this, but like I can go through them, like throughout the day, fairly, new different ones, coming through, like where one thing will put me in this state and then something else will, arise. And, it's not something that I feel like is something, I mean, some people have a job, maybe they need to control that or something like that, but I'm able to just kind of be curious and flow with that, but not really identify with any of it. So I try not to anyway. Sometimes I get merged as well, but that actually allows me to, like really move the energies that are here and see them more deeply and understand them. And I think in that they transform themselves almost, if not in fact. So we own several spheres, and then, you know, what we're doing is just learning from the experiences. And when we're in a certain state of consciousness, that's going to be reflected in our experience. Interesting, and still very deep. It's still sometimes hard to understand, like, where is this happening? But in some way it is reflecting something within us. Okay, so let's continue on to the incarnation of the Christ. When enough beings were ready and cognizant of God, and consciously desired to have complete union with God, the time was ripe for the most important part of the plan of salvation to take place, which Christ took upon himself. So, little background, during the process of the fall, the first spirit who fell, Lucifer, had developed an intense jealousy of Christ. And this created an adversarial stance toward Christ from Lucifer. So again, sort of the dominion versus divine love, and which one is going to bring true happiness, and sort of like jealousy, like oh, Jesus Christ was like favored, somehow by God. So the light bearer, the Luciferic consciousness, wanted to be seen, and felt like, God wasn't seeing him fairly. And so, again, the fall of consciousness into like a victimization state, like, and a lack of faith, the justice of God isn't just. So that immediately separates us from, that divine connection, and then, this gradual devolution happens. So part of what we're trying to do is remember God, right? And to find that direct connection within us again, because it's not just an intellectual belief, right? That we have to find the connection within our experiential selves, and feel, the help that's there, because we need the help and we can't do it by ourselves. And if we're anxious and fearful, then the subtlety and the calm, quiet, harmonies that are trying to support us are sort of blocked out, because of the intensity of our reactions to things. So Pathwork has a lecture on intensity as an obstacle to self-realization. So we're, me especially, I try to work a little more with intensity and letting that go, and, not denying or suppressing feelings, because I think if we can not merge with them, and we can allow them, to speak and express their truth, they can feel less, isolated, and they can feel us, and we can feel the divine. And so there's this kind of holding space when we're in trauma, when we're in, some difficulty, that we regress, we feel inadequate, and, the child nature within us is, it's beyond us. And so we go into our different traumas and dependencies and fearfulness and inadequacy, and so all of that is like, part of what is the clouds that cover the sky, that don't allow us to feel the support of the light and the angelic realm and the divine realm that's trying to help us with the passage. So, our work is in a way to not deny and avoid these feelings, but, not to get swept up into them as best we can. So back to the story here. So God made Christ the King of the universe, and as such, Christ possessed not only the highest privileges, but also the strongest responsibilities. By carrying the heaviest burden alongside his exalted position, he gave another example for the world to follow. Thus it was logical that Christ himself should prove his love by his great sacrifice and work, not only to all the other fallen creatures, but also to Lucifer himself, who through Christ's deed alone would one day in the far future find it possible to return to God and thus find ultimate happiness. So again, the plan of salvation was for all of the fallen creatures, even Lucifer, to be able to return to God and that not one would be lost. All right, which is sort of different than, I think, a traditional Christian understanding of, some people are deserving of being damned into hell or something like that. So in this version, it's like, it may take some time, but God's waiting with arms open for all of us to find our way back. Okay, so in this journey then, Christ's deed, it involved, first of all, sort of a negotiation and, to discern how can this happen? How can, we help the fallen angels ready to return to God and not violate God's free will, God's dictated free will or God's gift of free will, and still, like, not force Lucifer, right? Not violate Lucifer's free will. And so this is what happened. When the time was right, Christ faced Lucifer. Now there are so many spirits who do not wish to remain faithful to you. They desire to go back to God. Therefore, you should set them free. Lucifer would not agree to that. He maintained that he did not recognize divine law and would use his power as he saw fit. So Christ said, in this case, there must be a contest or a battle between us, between your forces and the forces of the divine world. Lucifer said, if such a battle took place, and if the divine forces won and took my power away, I still would not recognize the law of God as being just. Right? It's like, and he's basically saying, well, even if you won, that would just be more proof, that you cheated or, something was unjust. So, as you know from my previous lecture, this issue constituted an essential part of the plan of salvation, since no one should be eternally damned, not even Lucifer, and so that no eternal damnation would ever be possible. Lucifer himself would have to admit at all times the absolute justice of the divine laws. Therefore, Christ asked him, in what way would you consider the divine powers to be just? And Lucifer answered, I would consider this battle fair if one being from the world of God, who lived on earth like a man, without any protection or guidance from God's world at crucial times, and with a great part of his knowledge dimmed out, matter standing in the way, and yet remain faithful to God in spite of my temptations, in spite of the most difficult conditions possible. For I would offer this person every worldly power and release from all hardship if he forsook God. If he remained faithful to God under such conditions, which I doubt very much. In fact, I say it is impossible. If that happens, though, then I will have my battle with you, and if you would win, I would recognize God's laws as being utterly just. So, paraphrasing, kind of, if any high being from the world of God can remain true to God's laws and spirit under the most difficult of material conditions, and, in spite of, pain and suffering and all of the temptations for escape through temporary comfort, then he's saying, if somebody can resist all of that, then, a battle in the astral between the forces of light, would be considered, maybe a fair battle, and if the battle got won by the forces of light, that Lucifer would accept that was a fair and just win. Okay, So, you must know, my friends, that every living being has at all times guardian spirits from the world of God. But some people's attitudes may keep these spirits from coming too close. Nevertheless, they are there, even if only in the background, watching that nothing befalls their protege that is not according to God's laws of justice, or that the person may be too weak to endure. So, to be left alone without the support of God's spirit world on this earth sphere, and in addition, having to resist all attacks, challenges, hardships, and temptations that the powers of darkness could think of, seemed indeed an impossible task to fulfill. No human being had ever had to go through anything remotely like it. Therefore, Christ cannot be compared with any other person who has ever lived, no matter how pure or how wonderful the teachings may have been. Christ has shown indeed and in fact what others have taught, and he did it under infinitely more difficult circumstances than anyone else ever had to bear. So these were the conditions Lucifer set up for him to recognize God's laws as being just. If this seemingly impossible task were really to be fulfilled, then the battle could take place. Should Lucifer lose the battle, then Christ could make his terms, and Lucifer would not doubt God's justice in any respect. This then was the plan, and Christ took it upon himself for the above-mentioned reasons, though Lucifer did not specify that it had to be him. My friends, if you study all the scriptures from this point of view, you will get an entirely different understanding of them. I am quite sure that the reason for the life and death of Christ will now make sense to you. There would not be any sense in Christ dying on the cross for sins others have committed. If you have committed a sin, you yourself have to straighten it out, and no one else can or should do it for you. If someone else were to do it for you, you would not gain purification. You will also understand why Christ was left completely alone for a long time. Naturally, as a man, he did not have the same knowledge he had as a spirit. If he had had that same knowledge, the task would not have been so difficult. He did, of course, possess some knowledge, since he is the highest being in creation. In addition, he had a great deal of spiritual strength and wisdom. However, there would be no purpose to life on earth at all and this applies to everyone, the same spiritual knowledge were available in the flesh as when one is not incarnated. So, like the density of matter in the body, like we lose a lot of our understanding and connection and the knowledge that we had in the spirit world. And that was the same even of the, greatest being in existence. And so, it's like, while maybe more than the average human being, he too did not fully understand what was involved. So Christ did not know exactly what was involved while he lived on earth. In the course of the years, he received some knowledge and had a vague idea, just as any of you might have a vague idea of the task he was to fulfill. What may come of it, how it will end, what the exact meaning is, you will not know, and he did not know that either. He was not supposed to know it while incarnated. After a certain time, all the angels of God had to leave him. They were with him for some of his life, but were not present when the really difficult task began. The task was, as I explained, that he, left quite alone and cut off completely from the world of God, had to resist the temptations of Lucifer, who put the greatest effort imaginable into his goal to cause Christ to fall. He used every device possible, and in so doing he organized all his helpers. On the one side, Christ experienced nothing but suffering, both physical and psychological, as well as humiliation, the extent of which you cannot imagine. The humiliation and the psychological suffering were a great deal worse than the physical suffering, as bad as that was. And then on the other side, he was offered all the temptations of the world of darkness. And then on top of that, Christ was what you would call psychic to the maximum degree. And his mediumistic qualities were so strongly developed, not just in one respect, but in every respect, that they were greater than anyone else's before or after. Now, this was an advantage as long as God's world was close to him. But when he was cut off from it, this was merely an additional hardship, for all the manifestations coming to him originated from the world of darkness. Clairvoyantly, he came in contact first with high emissaries from the Luciferic world and later with Lucifer himself, who made himself appear as a beautiful being, offering Christ all the worldly advantages he might desire, and instant release from all his sufferings if he accepted Lucifer and gave up his idea of God. Lucifer taunted him in the worst moments of his sufferings. Where is your God of love and justice? If he existed, would he allow his beloved Son to go through all of this? If your God cannot offer you more, are you not better off with me? Look what I have to offer you. Your God can only offer you intense suffering and hardship in every possible way. Can you imagine what this meant? If Jesus had known the exact significance of his task, it would not have been half as difficult to resist. But this was precisely the point. To have doubts at these crucial times, doubts about everything, about his true identity, about there being any wise and good purpose in undergoing all the hardships which he could not understand at the time. In short, about everything he had learned in the previous year. Often he wondered whether he was not under some illusion, whether all his previous knowledge was not the product of imagination. During these times of doubt, Lucifer would instantly be at his side and strengthen such thoughts. How extremely hard it must have been for him, being a man and having matter between him and absolute truth, to remain faithful to God and not give in to these temptations aggravated by hardships. If the conditions of his task had not been such that even Christ might have doubted at times, his task would not have been so infinitely magnificent. Therefore, Christ had to have the same obstacles of matter as all other human beings, but his were intensified to a maximum degree. Material substance is a curtain, and man has to grope to open that curtain. Jesus Christ had to do the same, but in conditions of which you can only vaguely appreciate the extreme difficulty, even with these explanations. To remain on the right path under these circumstances, without fully understanding it, my friends, you cannot really know what it meant. And having the humility, in spite of all the passing thoughts of doubt, to put God above everything, even above his suffering, and above his not understanding why. It indeed seemed almost impossible that anyone could do it, but Christ did. It is not mere coincidence that his last utterance was recorded and passed on to humanity, in spite of it seeming so crassly contradictory to what people wanted to see in Jesus Christ. Jesus' last words on the cross expressed his doubt and fear that he was forsaken by God. This has puzzled many people. How could that great spirit doubt and fear? Human illusion and idealization would have preferred that Jesus died in a glory of faith, without the human doubts and fears he expressed in the hour of the culmination of his suffering. It was very important that this utterance be transmitted to humanity, since every single facet of Jesus' life and death has deep symbolic meaning for humanity's personal problems. So this utterance, too, must have significance. In his last hour, Jesus forgot all he had known, all the revelations and insights he had gained. Has it not happened to each one of you to some degree, in hours of desperation and anxiety, that even though your intellectual memory retained what you had learned and known, you were not in command of this knowledge? Your soul was in a dark night of unbelief and doubt. Deceiving yourself about this state of mind and not acknowledging how you really felt is not the right solution. To feel guilty and proud as you think I should not feel and think this way leads only to self-deception that delays your coming out of darkness. By doing this, Christ not only fulfilled the conditions by which the world of darkness could never at any time claim God's laws to be unjust, but at the same time he set an example for everyone born after him. So when you are in suffering and you do not understand why, think of Jesus Christ within the setting of the true story of salvation. Immediately after Christ had successfully completed his task on the earth's sphere, a number of so-called miracles took place on earth, showing mankind that a major phase in the history of creation was over and an important new phase was to begin. After Christ's physical death, he returned to the world of spirit, having fulfilled the conditions with a relatively small number of specialized spirits. He fought a spiritual battle in the world of darkness. That spirits should have wars, my friends, may again sound too human for you. But where do you think your wars come from? They are only an outpicturing of spiritual war. So a war took place between Christ and Lucifer. Again, Lucifer had to admit the justice of the ways of God's world. For as mentioned before, Christ came to fight under equal conditions. It would have been in his power not to take any risks by using greater strength and more helpers. However, he did not, and this was for the same reason that he undertook life on earth, for God's justice to be preserved, even in the eyes of Lucifer. The chances were even, and this was so apparent that not even Lucifer could deny it. That was important, for the plan was and is that Lucifer himself must ultimately come to the point when he too will return to God as the very last of the fallen creatures, since he was the first to turn away from the laws of God. Jesus Christ fulfilled the plan of salvation in every sphere. His task varied in each of the numerous spheres because each was different. In the world of God, where the manifold preparations were made, on the earth sphere, and in the world of darkness. After the battle was over, new conditions were set up, and they have reigned ever since. I think that's an interesting thing to think about. He's going to explain it here a little more. The new conditions meant that all human beings were given the opportunity to turn to God during their development on earth, going from one life to the other. Lucifer kept all the rights to tempt human beings to succumb to him by succumbing to their own lower nature. Should they resist, they would no longer be subjects of the Luciferic world, for the doors were now open to unite with their Creator and inhabit the divine worlds once more. Even the traps and temptations that Lucifer could use were, from that time on, limited. In accordance with divine law, God's spirit world now has the right to interfere. The divine laws must be observed in exactitude. The activities of the powers of darkness are limited and must stand ultimately before the jurisdiction of God. For Lucifer to still possess a certain amount of freedom is necessary, not only for the now so often explained reason that he must always recognize divine justice, but also as a necessary means for development. Evil has to be tasted to the brim in many cases before it can be overcome by free will and the being's own initiative. The desire to overcome must grow through ever-mounting enlightenment in each individual soul. And this often is only possible after one has gone through darkness. That such enlightenment cannot come in one lifetime goes without saying. to accomplish the perfection that is needed to enter into the kingdom of God, the perfection that was lost through the fall, and to shed all the darkness that has come upon a soul, can never be done in one lifetime. Many, many lives or incarnations are indeed necessary. Life on earth is like a school, where you develop from one class to the other. Sometimes you may stay for a while in one class, and then you may have one or several incarnations in succession where you accomplish a great deal. You see, it cannot be any other way, for it would be impossible to reach in one lifetime the necessary perfection needed to enter the kingdom of God for always. With each life, even in the worst cases, something is gained, even if the benefits can only be fully experienced at a later period. The outer personality, with its willpower and capability to decide one way or another, has the means one day to make the decisive step. I declare myself for God, for my higher self, with everything that it entails, disregarding the laziness, the conflict, the way of least resistance, to give in to one's faults, whether the faults are still murder, stealing, wickedness, or are now only selfishness, jealousy, envy, resentment, laziness, or whatever else, makes no difference in principle. Anyone truly declaring and deciding and remaining with the decision to follow the path to God, hence the salvation of Christ, cannot remain a subject of the Luciferic world. Lucifer will have no power over such a being, whether on earth or in the spirit world. This is the way Christ has opened the door. You may now understand why it is said that Christ saved you from your sins. This is accurate only in the sense that your great sin of falling, of not remaining faithful to God, of becoming at one time part of the world of darkness, does not have as a consequence eternal exclusion from the divine worlds. From this Christ has indeed saved you, and for this you certainly have all reason to be grateful to him. Through him you now have the possibility, by your own efforts and development, to cross the threshold. This, then, very briefly, is the story of the creation of the universe, the fall, the creation of this earth sphere, and the salvation through Jesus Christ. Be blessed, my dear ones. Be in God and in Christ. So, I hope you enjoyed this reading, and we're going to actually do this again this evening on a Zoom call. So, these recordings will be also available on YouTube. So, if this was something that sort of fed something in you, or, brought up some interesting, contemplations, I invite you to continue working with this a little. I find each time I read it, a little more of the mystery seems to clarify, and a little deeper, the surrender and the, remembrance of that divine connection. That is what we're here to find again. Okay.